You take a place like New York City, we are at near panic level. So what you say and how you communicate is very important. Should everybody stay home? Of course. Are we imprisoning people? No. Can you stay inside 24 hours a day? No. When you go out to shop or when you go out to take a walk and get exercise, social distancing.
I'm Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. And this is Ground Game. The coronavirus pandemic ranks among one of the most consequential stories we have ever covered at the Associated Press in our 170-year history. Here to take you inside the outbreak is AP's Ralph Russo.
From the Associated Press, this is Inside the Outbreak. I'm Ralph Russo. Today is Friday, March 27th. Less than 24 hours before this recording, the United States passed China and became the country with the most confirmed cases of COVID-19, now with just over 86,000. My guest on this episode is AP national writer Matt Sedensky. Matt recently wrote about the rhetoric of a pandemic. It's a language that can frankly sound a little ominous. Matt, thank you so much for joining me here at a time when we're all kind of busy here at the AP, especially you on the news side of things.
Yeah, we definitely are all busy.
So you wrote a story about a week or so ago about the language of an outbreak, the language of a pandemic. And on a personal note, I want to give you a little background. So my wife is an epidemiologist who happens to work in public health, and she's done that for as long as I've known her. So she tends to speak in the jargon of her profession. And when I first started dating her, she would toss around words that sounded kind of scary, like outbreak, in ways that sort of took me aback, but mostly they did so because I didn't really understand them. So when I was sort of read your story and was lured to it, that was sort of going through my head. The idea that we hear certain words, they sound a little ominous, but maybe we really don't understand the meaning and significance of them. So I want to start with this. Why was it significant that the World Health Organization a couple of weeks back decided to call this outbreak a pandemic?
Well, declaring it a pandemic is just a signal of the severity of it. And you had the WHO being pretty conservative in holding off on calling it a pandemic, in part because of the fear that a word like that can stir up. So the leader of that organization seemed to be saying, even if it's factually so, even if it's clear that this is active on multiple continents, there's potentially baggage that comes with that word. But the reason the WHO finally came to that decision 2 weeks ago was because a lot of people still weren't taking this seriously. A lot of the precautionary measures still weren't being taken. And so the organization just saw this as possibly adding the weightiness to the way we talk about an outbreak that might shake leaders and people out of complacency.
Yeah, it's interesting, the disconnect there between the clinical definition and the colloquial usage, and why they were hesitant to sort of use the clinical definition. So let me ask you this. Why is the rhetoric being used by public figures and leaders so important when we hear people from the president to Dr. Anthony Fauci talk about the pandemic?
Well, we're hearing the same sort of imagery repeated over and over again all over the globe, of being sort of in a fight against this invisible enemy. So with Donald Trump, who spent weeks suggesting this wasn't a big deal, now he's declaring himself a wartime president. In the state with the most cases in the U.S., New York, you have the governor, Andrew Cuomo, equating ventilators to missiles in this battle. Overseas in Europe, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, is telling his country we're at war. The German chancellor, Angela Merkel, calling it the biggest challenge since World War II. The public health community is doing some of that too. And I think from most quarters, a lot of it is to convey the seriousness of the problem and again, to shake people to attention.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost a call to action against the foe. I'm interested, how have definitions shifted during the outbreak?
We're seeing a few things happen. For one, we're seeing words that really should be different being conflated. For example, quarantine and isolation are often being used interchangeably when really one applies to sick people and the other applies to well people. And then particularly when we're talking about the restrictions being placed on large populations of people, we're just seeing a lot of different ways of talking about similar things. And then the meanings of those things shift from place to place. So when you heard about a lockdown in the Hubei province of China, where the virus is believed to have originated, that was about as strict as people could imagine. Movement beyond an apartment building being severely limited, monitors watching comings and goings, public transit came to a stop, officials going door to door, searching for infected people. So once outbreaks began happening elsewhere, in South Korea and Italy and elsewhere in Europe and now in the US, there was a lot of alarm related to talking about being locked down. But we've seen a Wuhan lockdown is not a Milan lockdown or a San Francisco lockdown. And partly because of that, you're seeing that language morphing too. You have some leaders talking about this as sheltering in place. And in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo has begun talking about it as being on a pause.
Yeah, the interesting thing about shelter in place, and living in New York, I got to see Cuomo's news conference where he actually pushed back against the shelter in place and said, no, that's an antiquated term. I'm wondering if there's anything else that sort of changed meetings or terms that you've seen pop up where folks have pushed back and said, no, that's not really what we mean, and that's an antiquated term.
Yeah, and shelter in place sort of has its origins in kind of the nuclear era and people preparing for nuclear fallout. And gathering in some central room without windows, waiting for an all-clear signal. Cuomo himself was talking when you had the first major outbreak in the New York metropolitan area in one of the suburbs. He was talking about setting up a containment zone. Now he's sort of regretted using that language. So even within individual leaders, you see a shift in language.
So, Matt, one of the things you sort of wrapped up your story with, and I know we're cautious to make light of anything having to do with the coronavirus, but it was the idea of the language sort of seeping into the pop culture. Is there anything that's taken hold yet among the coronavirus rhetoric that has sort of become pop culture, maybe something that we might find in the Urban Dictionary in a year or two?
I think we're going to have to wait a while to see what stands the test of time. But when you talk to linguists, they're really struck by how quickly two things at least have caught on. One is flattening the curve, which is a relatively complex epidemiological principle that's being repeated again and again, in which the public seems to have grasped using that simple language. And the other is the thing that is defining so many of our lives right now, social distancing. That's a phrase that had been around in academic circles among social scientists for a while, but really is being used incredibly widely for the first time. And there may be potential there for each of those things to stay part of the vernacular and maybe get used in other contexts. We'll see how long this pandemic is with us and the lethality of it. That may have a lot to do with the ways we talk about it going forward and whether some of the more tongue-in-cheek references to quarantinis or quaran babies or referring to this virus as Rona or the Ronies. Those are all things that you see repeated online a lot. Whether anyone is still saying those things in 6 months or a year. But this is something that could be a life-defining experience for many people, so it wouldn't be surprising if you had associations with words in the same way Ground Zero became linked with 9/11, or more relative to this, how plague, the disease at the center of past pandemics that killed tens of millions of people, has now become sort of the go-to word to refer to something bad.
Okay, I want to step away from that story for a second and wrap it up with a big picture question. You've been a journalist for a long time. As this story has evolved, when did you sort of realize the enormity of it?
Well, I think like a lot of people in the West, I knew of the virus in China and it sounded awful, but it took a while to see the direct connection to my own life. And then 6 weeks ago, I was sent to Asia to help with our reporting on the outbreak. And over the course of my month there, it went from being mainly a China problem to a major problem in South Korea to one finding a foothold in the Middle East, especially Iran, and Europe, particularly Italy. And so you were kind of watching the tentacles of this thing constantly creep further and further toward the place you call home. And so while it was no surprise that it actually started spreading in the US, it was still pretty jarring to get back here 10 days ago and watch that all play out.
Matt Sedensky is an AP national writer. He has been covering the coronavirus outbreak all over the world for the Associated Press. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today, and good luck wherever this story takes you next.
Thank you, Ralph.
To add on to my discussion with Matt about understanding terminology of the outbreak, allow me, after tapping into my wife's expertise, to define a couple of terms that are especially relevant. Two ways to fight the spread of a virus are containment and mitigation. Containment strategy tries to identify those infected, along with anyone that person has been in contact with, and remove them from the population for a period of time to get over the virus. That requires a lot of testing and is very difficult in a huge country where many people travel all over the world. Mitigation strategy acknowledges the virus is in the community and tries to limit its spread with things like social distancing.
That's it for this episode of Ground Game. With both a pandemic and a presidential campaign to keep an eye on, we'll be here every step of the way, giving you all the news you need to know. Be sure to tell a friend about us, and please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Some of the details of our discussion may have changed by the time you hear this. For up-to-date developments on all of your news, head over to apnews.com.
From the Westwood One Podcast Network.